Hi, my name is Katie Adams. I'm on the board of the Exeter LitFest, and I'm also a book editor. So the way this panel is going to work today is I'm going to introduce, we have Lara Prescott and Annie Hartnett. I'm going to introduce Lara first. She's going to do a short reading from her book, and then Annie will do the same. I'm going to introduce Annie, and then she'll read too, and then I'll ask some questions, and then if you have any, save them up. So Lara Prescott is the author of The Secrets We Kept, a New York Times bestseller, Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick, Barnes & Noble Discover pick, and Edgar nominee, and has been translated into 30 languages, all of which she will name, I'm sure. It weaves together the story of the publication of the smash hit Dr. Zhivago in both the Soviet Union and the world, and the lives of the women who worked to get it into readers' hands, each for her very own different reasons.
All right, thank you. Let me just tilt this up. So I'm just going to read from the very beginning of the book, so I'm not going to give away any spoilers if you haven't read it. This section is the prologue, and it's called The Typists. We typed 100 words per minute and never missed a syllable. Our identical desks were each equipped with a mint-shelled Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter, a black Western Electric rotary phone, and a stack of yellow steno pads. Our fingers flew across the keys. Our clacking was constant. We'd pause only to answer the phone or to take a drag of a cigarette. Some of us managed to master both without skipping a beat. The men would arrive around 10. One by one, they'd pull us into their offices. We'd sit in small chairs pushed into the corners while they'd sit behind their large mahogany desks or pace the carpet while speaking to the ceiling. We'd listen. We'd record. We were their audience of ones for their memos, write-ups, reports, lunch orders. Sometimes they'd forget we were there, and we learned much more. Who was trying to box out whom? Who was making a power play? Who was having an affair? Who was in and who was out? Sometimes they refer to us not by name, but by their hair or hair color or body type. Blondie, red, tits. We had our secret names for them too. Grabber, coffee breath, teeth. They would call us girls, but we were not. We came to the agency by way of Radcliffe, Vassar, Smith. We are the first daughters of our families to earn degrees. Some of us spoke Mandarin. Some could fly planes. Some of us could handle a Colt 1873 better than John Wayne. But when we were interviewed, all we were asked was, "Can you type?" It's been said that the typewriter was built for women, that to truly make the key sing requires the feminine touch, that our narrow fingers are suited for the device, that while men lay claim to cars and bombs and rockets, the typewriter is a machine of our own. Well, we don't know about all that. But what we will say is that as we typed, our fingers became extensions of our brains, with no delay between the words coming out of their mouths, words they told us not to remember, and our keys slapping ink onto paper. And when you think about it like that, about the mechanics of it all, it's almost poetic. Almost. But did we aspire to tension, headaches, and sore wrists and bad posture? Is that what we dreamed of when in high school, when studying twice as hard as the boys? Was clerical work what we had in mind when opening the fat manila envelopes containing our college acceptance letters? Or what we thought we'd be headed to as we sat in those white wooden chairs on the 50-yard line, capped and gowned, receiving the rolled parchment paper that promised we were qualified to do so much more? Most of us view the job in the typing pool as temporary. We wouldn't admit it aloud, not even to each other, but many of us believed it would be the first rung towards achieving what the men got right out of college, positions as officers, our own offices, with lamps that gave off a flattering light, plush rugs, wooden desks, our own typists taking down our dictation. We thought of it as a beginning, not an end, despite what we've been told all our lives. Thanks.
Okay, and Annie Hartnett has an MFA from Alabama and is the author of the novels Rabbit Cake and Unlikely Animals. Rabbit Cake was a Kirkus Book of the Year and a finalist for a New England Book Award. Unlikely Animals, her most recent book, was longlisted for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize and was named a Best Book of the Year by Book Riot and The Washington Post. It tells the story of Emma, a natural healer if med school dropout, who returns to her eccentric New Hampshire hometown to care for her dying father and confront a host of ghosts, both fantastical and all too real.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to read you a quick scene where the father who has a brain disease is with a ghost who was a real-life New Hampshire figure. He was a real-life Dr. Dolittle. So you'll meet him in this fictional way, but I think it's fun to know that he was a real guy who lived with animals in his house. So, Clive woke up from his afternoon nap to find the ghost of Ernest Harold Baines sitting at the edge of his bed. This was unusual, Clive thought. The ghost had never shown up in the bedroom before. Death must be coming soon. What a lonely thought. Clive bravely dragged himself out of bed anyway and noticed he'd been napping in his undershirt and undies. It was 2 p.m., but he threw on his bathrobe and slippers. He saw no reason to get dressed, with nowhere to be, no classes to teach. Clive and Harold went downstairs, with Moses the dog on their heels, and they found the house was empty. Yet again, Moses was the only Starling family member standing guard. In the bright kitchen of the Corbin caretaker's house, Clive poured out an afternoon snack, 3 bowls of cereal, 1 for him, 1 for Harold, and 1 for the fox, in case the ghost of Harold's pet fox finally decided to show up, the ghostly vision Clive had seen only once, standing at the edge of the woods that day, the day his daughter Emma had finally come home. Clive knew the fox was the creature that Harold loved most in all the world, but he never came around with Harold. Clive was a little miffed by it. Still, Clive was glad his friend had some company, since Harold had said his wife, Louise, wasn't with him in the woods. She had gone to travel the world after his death, Harold had explained. She'd outlived him by many years. She'd been a successful photographer in Europe and had ended up buried in Nova Scotia. She'd always wanted to be near the ocean. It made Clive awfully happy he still had his own wife to hear Harold talk about Louise. Clive went to put his cereal bowl in the sink, and he looked out the kitchen onto the front lawn. There, in the midday sunshine, was a deer standing in the snow. "I'm sure she'd like a snack, too," Harold said. Clive agreed, and so he went out with a bowl of cereal. More corn pops from the Starling's endless supply. When Clive extended the yellow puffs to the deer, he felt like he could read her mind. He felt like he knew everything about her, how glad she was to see him. Now, most deer would have run from Clive Starling. He was wearing a bathrobe and an undershirt and what Clive students would call tighty-whitey underwear. But this particular deer was remarkably bold, and she had been and had been fed by children before, had discovered the joys of the packaged foods available on the playground at recess time. The children at Dreamfar Elementary had fed this deer fruit roll-ups and peanut butter sandwiches, carrot sticks and Ritz crackers, and even, once or twice, a slice of ham. The children had the good sense not to feed the deer any chocolate items, since they knew that chocolate can kill a dog, so it could likely kill a deer too. So this particular deer, whom Clive Starling quickly named Bambi, as though he were a man with no imagination and not a professional poet, ate corn pops straight from Clive's palm. "That tickles Bambi," Clive said. The deer had whiskers underneath her jaw. Clive Starling reached into the cereal box again. Boy, did he feel like a friend to all animals at that moment. He was inhabiting the spirit of the noble Harold Baines. If there is only so much life left in this skin, Clive thought, I am glad I've had this experience. And he looked the deer over lovingly. It was only then, he reported to everyone later, that he noticed that the deer was covered with some kind of pearlescent paint. This deer, his Bambi, had been shot, but only by a paintball gun. Clive had heard about this, why someone would do this. The high school kids were into night hunting, or flashlight hunting, which is illegal, because a deer will freeze when you shine a light at it, and that unfair advantage makes it poaching, not hunting. The high schoolers had started shooting deer up with glow-in-the-dark paint in the hopes that they wouldn't have to use flashlights to find the deer at night. "Let's get you cleaned up," Clive said to Bambi. "I'll get a wet towel." And then Clive realized this was the ultimate test. Ernest Harold Baines had not only fed wild animals, he had lived with them, invited them into his home. Clive Starling did not stop to think of any of the consequences, what his wife might say. Clive Starling didn't think of his wife at all as he lured the deer into the house, one corn pop after the next corn pop. He walked backwards, and soon they were up the 4 porch stairs. Bambi took the stairs one by one like she'd been walking stairs her whole life, and soon they were in the house. The poor dog ran upstairs to hide. Clive and the deer were in the front hall. Then they were in the kitchen. Bambi was standing in the kitchen. Bambi's back was as tall as the countertops. It struck Clive only then how large this animal was and how hooved. "What the heck do I do now, Harold?" Clive said to the ghost, but the ghost was not around. Ernest Harold Baines was no longer at the kitchen table, and even Moses was nowhere to be seen. And then Clive remembered that he had to wash the paint off the deer. He poured the remaining cereal into a bowl and left Bambi munching away as he went upstairs to get a towel and some paint-removing supplies. In the bathroom cabinet upstairs, Clive found the thing he was looking for, nail polish remover with acetone. He knew this was the best thing to remove paint quickly. His wife had taught him that much. He splashed acetone on the towel and went downstairs toward the deer, the open bottle in one hand, the towel in the other. He wanted to clean her up quickly while he still had cereal left to feed her. It might have all worked out fine. But Bambi had lived long enough to associate certain smells with fear and otherwise bad feelings. What Clive Starling did not know, because he was not a gunman, had never been a gunman, was that acetone is often used in a homemade mixture to clean your gun. Many hunters in New Hampshire used a homemade mixture, and Bambi knew the smell of acetone. Clive could tell, as soon as he was face to face with her again, what she was thinking, and that he'd made a major mistake. In the sunny yellow kitchen of the caretaker's house of the Corbin Mansion, Bambi went berserk. Thank you.
Hello?
Hello. Okay, we're
Yeah.
good. Okay. Thank you both. That was great. Okay, so I want to start with a question that always intrigues readers, which is, how much of your novel is true? Lara, in your case, you write about the fraught publication of the novel Dr. Zhivago and the CIA's involvement. Annie, one of the characters in your novel, is in sort of a spiritual conversation with a real 19th century naturalist. When you decide to incorporate history into your fiction, how do you decide what to preserve and what to invent?
Sure. So yeah, my book is based on true events, as they say. It's the reason I started writing about it is I was named Lara after the main character in Dr. Zhivago. So I've always had a love of that novel and had read it numerous times growing up. Back in the day, I used to work in politics in Washington, D.C., and basically what I call writing propaganda. I was a speech writer, and I hated it, and I started trying to become a fiction writer. But it was around that time that my father sent me a Washington Post article about this almost stranger-than-fiction tale about how the CIA used Dr. Zhivago as a tool during the Cold War and how they smuggled it in behind the Iron Curtain where it was banned. And the first thing I read about it was this absolutely crazy mission where they used the Vatican Pavilion at the World's Fair in 1958 and posed as priests and nuns and handed the book to Soviet visitors. And I thought, this is absolutely incredible. I have to find out everything I can about it. And as soon as I read all of these CIA documents that were just released, I realized that there were so many redactions, so many figures of the CIA officers were erased from history completely, forever. And that's when I started thinking, like, I want to fill in the blanks of fiction. And so those characters of the CIA, led by the typing pool, which I just read from, but you kind of go into different characters. lives after that point, they're fictional. But I did so much research of what these women's lives were like, the women that worked in the early days of the CIA. On the other side, we have Boris Pasternak. He's a real person. We have Olga Ivanskaya, his mistress and muse. That side, the eastern side, is more historically accurate. And I tried my best to use all of the primary resources available to me. I traveled to Russia, did a lot of research to get that. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's fiction. So I imagine what it was like to be in their shoes.
That's super fascinating. I'm always like so interested in how people write real historical fiction, because mine is not real historical fiction. There are elements of truth to it. The author's note at the beginning says, this is a novel, I made it up, but some of the really neat historical stuff is true, which is kind of was my mantra about this book, that I wasn't going to try to teach anyone anything. That is what I love about historical fiction, that I feel like I do learn some things that are true. But this book, I was writing a book that was semi-magical, that was about a woman with a slight healing touch. So she comes home to take care of her father, who has a brain disease. And that was where the book I started. It's my second novel. Second novels are famously hard to write. And so I was kind of in a bad place with my relationship with writing. Just feeling like, am I a one-hit wonder? Do I even like writing anymore? You know, and I happened to be up in visiting friends in Newport, New Hampshire, which is near Sunapee, and we were driving around. We had gone to get a Christmas tree, and we're driving around, and all of a sudden, if you haven't been to Newport, which probably most people have not, but it's just sort of an ordinary town. And there are no mansions there, that's what I'm trying to say, that it's not like a super wealthy town. So, but I look up, and within all the pine trees at the top of this hill is this enormous, beautiful, epic yellow mansion. And I'm like, what is that place? Who lives, like, is it a hotel? Is it a spa? Can we go there? And at the base of the driveway, it says they're trespassing. So I'm like, that's a private residence. Like, who lives there? What? Where am I? And so we go back to their house, and I start Googling, you know, huge yellow mansion, Newport, New Hampshire. And then I find out this, like, just amazing rabbit hole of information about the man who had built that mansion. His name was Austin Corbin. He was a 19th century robber baron who made money in all sorts of wild ways, and then returned to his hometown and built this mansion. And legend has it, and I don't have proof of this, but that he knocked down the house that he had been born in and built the mansion around just his childhood bedroom, which I was like, that's weird. And then he bought up, behind the mansion, he bought up 26,000 acres and made a hunting park and shipped in animals from all over the world. And the hunting park is still there today, and it takes up parts of 5 different towns. It's a huge, like, you can see it, if you look at the map in New Hampshire, you can see it because roads don't go through it. And it's privately owned now. It was sold out of the family after World War II. So I just get obsessed, and because of my style of writing, I didn't think that I could write historical fiction. I don't think I would be very good at it, so I didn't really know what I was doing all this research, because I was writing a book that was very much set like now with the internet, and all my characters always, you know, when I need them to not have the cell phone, they leave their cell phone, but most of the time they have a cell phone. And then I found out, as I continued my research, about Ernest Harold Baines, who is a ghost in the book. It was a real man who was invited to work at the edge of the park, and he was the naturalist of this hunting park from 1904 till 1925. And all his writings about his life with animals, he had bear, he had foxes, he had deer, as you probably guessed, and he wrote all these books about it, and all the books and all the photographs, and there are just like hundreds and hundreds of photographs of him with these animals, are in the public domain. so I could play with them as much as I wanted. So as you read the book, Ernest Harold Baines, the naturalist, is a ghost in the book. You just saw how he plays with Clive, who's a live human, and then that was really a fun way to get some history in. And then I put in excerpts just because these stories were so cool, and no one was doing anything with them, So that made me sort of jealous of people who write historical fiction because it was so fun. And so those stories are all true. I didn't change anything about what happens with the animals. I just did more of an erasure poem that I wrote all what he wrote out, and then I would condense it just because they had to be as short as possible. And then I added a little bit because I found out through my research that he was a big womanizer. And so he would, basically, naturalists weren't paid very much, but he needed to raise money for the animals, and so one way that he raised money was just by flirting with rich women. So I love that detail about it, so I wanted to work it in. So he never wrote about this, it's just historians know about it. So he never, in his books about animals, never was and also, here's about this juicy love affair I'm having. So I had to work that into his writing, which was super fun as well.
Well, so speaking of Ernest, both of your stories are full of characters that are haunted by history. Do you think that feeling of haunting is part of the human condition? What do you think is the difference between being haunted by something and simply remembering it? And then is there a relationship between personal family history and national history when it comes to that kind of haunting? You can just answer one of those if you want.
Well, I could speak about, I think one of my characters that's definitely haunted, I'll talk about Sally. She's one of the members of the typing pool that's pulled out for another mission. She's what, they would call a honeypot, this gorgeous woman who could seduce men, get their secrets, and kind of toss them aside. And her history is one I came across when I was doing this research about who were these women that were entering the CIA. During this is pre-Langley. This is just a bunch of Ivy Leaguer guys in various undisclosed basements throughout DC planning missions about books. It was a wild time. And what happened was a lot of these women who worked in the early days of the CIA had been in World War II alongside Alan Dulles and Frank Wisner, and they were doing missions like blowing up bridges and ferrying resistance fighters to the front lines. And I read about these women like Betty McIntosh and Virginia Hall. There's amazing books about her. And what would it be like then you go to the CIA and they're like, here, you can be behind a desk now. That's your position. You're not going to go up any further. And so Sally's haunted by that in her past of what she was capable of then, and then being reduced to almost a body in the present time. And I think she's in a transition mode where she's thinking maybe that isn't how I'm important. Maybe there's more to myself than what they told me. And I think that, if you're having these, feelings of being haunted by something, you can either let it drag you down or there could be a change. And I think Sally's one of the characters that goes with the change. And I won't give away the spoiler of what happens, but she becomes empowered from it, which I think is really interesting. And of course, Boris Pasternak's very haunted while he's writing Dr. Zhivago, because he has this elevated status as the most famous poet in the Soviet Union. He's been protected, but he's also seen his friends dragged out in the street and killed, or dragged out, taken to the gulag, never to seen again. And he has a bit of survivor's guilt, I think. I try to portray of why was I spared? Because Stalin liked his poetry. And so you see him figuring that out and almost using that as, I'm not going to back down. They're banning my book, but I'm not going to back down, and using that for perhaps courage or something good.
That was cool. So my book is, They call it a tragic comedy. I consider it a comedy. That's just with my dark sense of humor. And that's one thing that fuels my writing. So I feel like most of the time when I'm writing about haunting, I am trying to have fun with what you can do with supernatural haunting. There's a lot also of there are family history and things that the family are trying to figure out. They're broken in various ways at the beginning. But in terms of the literal haunting, so Ernest Harold Baines became the first ghost in the book, and it made sense, as I'm struggling to figure out how can I assemble this book I become obsessed with the history, but I know I'm not going to write historical fiction. I'm writing this semi-magical story about a girl and a woman who's come home. She has with the magical touch to take care of her father and to deal with her brother who's been to rehab a couple times, and her mother who's just had it with everything that's been going on in the family. And so she comes home, and so I knew that she was going to have to deal with her father who has this brain disease, which I never commit to saying what it is, partly because I don't ever want to have to be factually accurate. So it's called a mysterious brain disease in the book. It's mostly people who really know Lewy body dementia always say to me, why didn't you just say it was Lewy body dementia? It sounds like Lewy body dementia. I'm like, well, yes, but it's more fun to make it a mysterious brain disease. But so he has seen hallucinations of animals, and I had that originally, and then it was well, it's easy to invite him to also see a ghost. So that's where my first ghost came from. And then the thing that really tied the whole, there's so much going on in the book together, was the history and the semi-magical story that is set in 2014, was adding more ghosts, because I realized when I was at MacDowell, which is a writer's colony in Petersboro, New Hampshire, that I had written the whole draft of this book, and I had realized, my friend had told me, who's telling this story? It seems to be, it's third person omniscient, but whoever is telling it has so much personality. And so I kind of backed myself into a corner, because I was if it's third person omniscient, but they keep telling jokes, but I can't just, change it into first person and have someone tell it when they go into the head of the dog, no, I would like to be omniscient, but I'm not. And so that's when I realized, I was at MacDowell, and I realized, okay, well, this is where Thornton Wilder wrote Our Town, and it would make sense in some ways to have it told from the ghosts, because then I have so much freedom. So the ghosts really, in some ways, just made the book more fun for me and changed the tone. So the haunting, I was haunted by Thornton Wilder. He helped me,
So that leads me to the next question, which is you both use first person plural periodically. Can you talk about sort of why you chose that and what was challenging about it once you were kind of into it?
Yeah, I'll say, so the first voice that came to me when I was writing this novel is the voice of the typist, which I just read from. The first sentence of the novel came to me in the middle of the night, which never happens. I know, it's such a cliche, but I wrote it down on my phone, and I was having fun with it. I was reading all these documents and doing all this research, and I was thinking, who are the people that know what's been redacted? And then I was well, the CIA officers, but also the people that typed these memos and reports, and went down this rabbit hole of the typists. So I was trying to have fun with it and have this almost Greek chorus narrate this mission, because they know all the secrets, they can fill in all the holes. But I quickly, and I really wanted to write the whole novel that way, but it ran into a lot of problems because they act like they're omniscient, but they're not. They have limited information, and one of that came to a problem because I was well, how are they going to know how important this novel is? Because the CIA, it's just a book, and it's an opportunity, but for the other side, it's life and death. So for Boris Pasternak and those who surround him, it's life and death, and I quickly realized I'd have to tell the eastern side of the story as well. So while my typist come and go throughout, and they know certain things, and they think they know everything, but they don't. I have other voices that filled it in, and that's really what made me understand that this was a novel and not I was working as a short story for a while and realized this is more.
I have only read half of Laura's book, but I was so excited to see the we because it is. I love books that use it even, and then I didn't know that I was going to use it in this book. I was really I wanted to write it. One reason I was so excited to come here today is because after my first book, Rabbit Cake, came out, a bunch of my father's friends told me, "You write so much like John Irving. He must be a huge influence." And I was embarrassed because, everyone has gaps in their reading history, and I had to say, I didn't say, I said, yes, I love John Irving, is what I said. But what I thought inside was I had not read any John Irving, and I knew that probably I had been influenced by people who had been influenced by him, but I had not read any of his books. So at that point, enough people had mentioned that to me that I was like, well, I really should read John Irving. And so I started reading John Irving, and I was like just so in love and so excited, and just was like, now that makes me think of what else I can do with a novel, because my favorite thing about John Irving novels now, having read not all of them, but I've read I think I've read 6 or 7 of them, is how they give you information that you don't think you need, and then he uses it again in a big way at the end. And so that really excited me, of just thinking about how to build a bigger plot. So I wanted to do that with this book, and that's why I chose the third-person omniscient for that first draft of it, is because I thought that was a way, and that's what he sometimes uses first person, but in GARP, I think, you can see that the third-person omniscient gives him a lot of freedom. And so that's what, and I knew I couldn't do first-person again, because first-person was the mode that I had done for my first novel, and first-person was that the voice of that character was so strong in my head, I just had to get some distance from her before I tried first-person again. So I did the third-person omniscient, and then, like I said, my friend said, well, who's telling it has too much personality? And so I thought, well, the ghost would have personality, and they would be able to have opinions about the 2 time periods I'm trying to connect, because time for them is always happening, because they're both thinking about their past, and they're very engaged with the living people in the town. And then another book that helped me as I was trying to figure out how I could do that Greek chorus was The Mothers by Britt Bonet, which is an awesome book, and she just shows, she uses it, the we, and it starts with the we, and then they come and they go. So I think usually if you're going to tell a whole book in the collective we, you have to either dip into the I or dip in or make it third person, because it gets annoying, I think, if you use it too much. So either it makes sense to divide it and go into different points of view, as Lara did, or to make it almost to disappear, so it feels like third person most of the time. So
I remember I wrote this book during my MFA at the University of Texas, and my thesis advisor is an amazing writer named Elizabeth McCracken. Go buy all her books. I remember showing her the first pages, and I said, can I do that? Can I do this? And she goes, this is advice for any writer out there. And she goes, Lara, you can do anything you want. And so you can have these, the voice of the we, and then you could go to the I, and you could go to third person. You could do whatever you want. The best way to tell the story is how you're figuring it out. So I often tell myself, because I make a complicated story. I try not to, but I write very complicated first drafts, and I'm like, can I do that? And I'm like, yeah, you can. That's your strength. Do it.
Okay, so I think can I borrow yours? I just ask one more question, and then we'll throw it out. So I'm wondering, each of your novels, the characters run up against sort of capital I issues, homophobia, opioid crisis. I'm wondering how you balance dealing with these issues in a way that you know is at least emotionally accurate with the authenticity of the character, you know, because of course you're not going to try to like teach a lesson about a serious issue, and you want it to feel authentic through the characters, and how you balance that out.
The hard question, I'll go first. Yeah, so in my book, which is set in a real town, it's a fictionalized version of Newport, New Hampshire. I don't know, when you write the first draft, in some ways you just make choices and you're not sure why you're making them. And so I did spend a lot of time in Newport, New Hampshire and hear a lot of stories about, you know, the people that I got to know there. And so I don't know if I made that decision to have the character having gone to rehab a couple times because of some of the stories I told, or if I was just trying to, I think at the beginning you always want to make things tough for your characters because you want them to sort of go through hell and then come out the other side at the end changed. Sometimes some writers make things worse for them at the end, and some of them will make them better, but you want them to be changed by the end. And so I knew that was going to be something that had caused friction with the sister and the brother, that he had sort of been a failure to launch from this small town, and then she had left and gone out and was supposed to do great things and then comes crawling back with her tail between her legs, but her brother is just kind of like, you don't know what I've been through. So in some ways that choice was just within the family, trying to make the family more fractured, but then it also opened the book up so much into sort of like, okay, this story that sometimes my mantra when writing this story was, I got a review with Rabbit Cake that was a positive review, but you only remember the negative line, and so there was one line in it that said, you know, in some ways they compare me to this Pulitzer Prize winner, but she veers toward the silly. And so I was like, that's true. and I don't want to think that's a bad thing about my work. And so I made a plaque that says veer toward the silly. And so, but then adding, you know, real elements from life to give the book more gravity and give it meaning. And then so the book becomes about not just the silliness, which I do welcome, because I think life is, you know, there's a lot of grief and there's a lot of joy, and sometimes silliness is how we get through the worst things. So adding that to the book just made the whole thing matter more and the stakes higher. And then you do your research to make sure that, you know, you're being respectful and that you really considered things from everyone's point of view. So yeah, that was something that sort of snuck up on me, but I think makes the book a much better book. So.
Yeah, I think for me, humor is definitely the light that balances the darkness. I remember when I was writing the book, two of my classmates were from former Soviet countries, and they have this amazing dark gallows humor, which I absolutely adored. And it's the way, you know, using humor is the way you get through things. And, you know, I put my characters through a lot. Some of them historically because they went through a lot, and others because I thought that was their trajectory. One character in particular, I saw her ending before I knew how she got there. And I almost worked backwards of, you know, what would make someone do X, Y, and Z, and then I kind of worked backwards to see what happened. But, you know, I think having a really dark scene, and then you're kind of going to the typus again, and there's humor there, and there's humor in these dark times that I'm describing. And I think writing humor is so much more difficult than writing the really sad stuff, if you ask me. And if you don't have that humor, then you really can't see the book for the darkness for what it is.
Any audience questions? Come on.
I'm really surprised to hear that the Maple Street ghosts were a late add-in because I adored them. And it's a sort of a silly question, but are they real people? Were they real? Because they're individual characters, kind of.
Well, thank you for reading it. Can you hear me? Is this on? It is. It's really stuck to this. No, they are not real people. I have like weird ethical boundaries, and and some of them are like truly stupid boundaries. Like I never name a business after a real business, even though I think a business in the book there's a hair salon in town which I had forever called the name of the real hair salon in town, which is called Hair Force One, and I like could have left. No one's gonna get mad at me for including that, but I changed it actually because I thought I made a better joke. Although every time I say Hair Force One, everyone laughs. But I was taking a run and I came across a hair salon called Sheer Imagination, and I was like, wouldn't it be funny if it's called Sheer Imagination, but they only do one buzz cut? So they, so the people in the cemetery, you can go to Maple Street Cemetery, you can visit the cemetery. I mean, it's more valuable if you're going to go take a drive to see the mansion. Just put Corbin Bridge, and the mansion is, you'll stand at the base of the driveway and see the amazing mansion. But it's also fun. I love it when some people send me pictures and they're in the cemetery. They're not real people. I would like construct them based on what I wanted them to say, and then, they would get their personality that way, so. And their dates, yes. And I lived across from a cemetery. Well, I lived in a cemetery when I was in graduate school in Alabama. So I have always gone to. I moved to Alabama right after there was a big tornado there, which wiped out a lot of the graduate student housing. So I rented a house that hadn't been rented in years, which is like only makes it creepier to move into a groundskeeper's. It was the groundskeeper's house in the middle of a cemetery. So that was really before I wrote most of the book, several years before, but it made me think, because I would walk around the cemetery every day with my dog, and it made me think of it's the best possible place to get names because you get to see first and last names together. I have a very hard time thinking of I can come up with a first name, but be like, what would their last name be, and then what does that? So it's so much easier to go and see them fully. So I did probably get some names, some real names from the cemetery in Providence, where I also lived right across the street from. But
the whole hour on that.
But I think I probably scrambled them up, and I don't think probably anyone made it into the final draft in their full form. So.
Maybe one more? Okay, well, I'll ask. Oh, you got one? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't even entirely have a question. I more wanted to say I'm a librarian, and both of your books have been staff picks of mine that I've absolutely loved. And
Thank you so much.
They sit on our staff picks display, and I had no idea, actually, that, Lara, that you were from New Hampshire. I didn't know anything, or that you live in New Hampshire.
I just moved here, kind of.
Oh,
Yeah.
I don't feel so bad. And that's just another indicator of how much talent there is in New Hampshire. And Annie, I just wanted to say your book truly changed my relationship with local cemeteries, because I used to get a little, I don't know, sad or weirded out or something, and the idea of the people in the cemeteries just sort of rooting for the living and kind of commenting on us was so appealing to me that now, I drive by a local cemetery and I'm like, hi guys, So that's like a gift, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
So I think we're all set. The books are available for sale in the back, and I think Lara and Annie would be willing to sign any copies. And we have another great event coming up at 4, so please stay for that. Thank you.
Thank you.